The war ended on May 8, 1945, when Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the unconditional surrender document in Berlin-Karlshorst. But for thousands of German women captured by Red Army forces, that date marked not liberation, but the beginning of a long disappearance into the vast Soviet Gulag system stretching from the Ural Mountains to the permafrost plains of Kolyma. These were not the combat nurses or Luftwaffe auxiliaries celebrated in propaganda reels. They were signals operators, anti-aircraft gun crews, administrative clerks, medics stationed in field hospitals, and civilian refugees swept up in the chaotic final retreat through East Prussia and Pomerania. Their fate remains one of the least documented tragedies of the Second World War, a shadow archive of lost lives buried beneath official silence on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Recent research estimates that between 50,000 and 70,000 German women fell into Soviet captivity between 1944 and 1945, but fewer than half ever saw their homeland again. The rest vanished into labor camps, where temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius in winter, where daily bread rations measured 200 grams of moldy rye mixed with sawdust, where typhus and dysentery killed more prisoners than exhaustion ever could. This is their story, told through declassified NKVD transport manifests, Red Cross repatriation records, survivor testimonies collected in the 1990s after Soviet archives partially opened, and the haunting silence of families who waited decades for letters that never arrived. If you've ever wondered what happened to those who fought on the losing side, who wore the wrong uniform in the wrong place at the wrong time, stay with this account. The truth is harder than fiction, and history demands we bear witness, even when the story offers no heroes, no redemption, only the cold arithmetic of survival and loss. The collapse began in January 1945, when Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front launched Operation Vistula Oder, a crushing offensive involving 2.2 million Soviet troops, 6,400 tanks, and 46,000 artillery pieces that smashed through German defensive lines in Poland and drove toward the Oder River in just 23 days. Entire Wehrmacht divisions disintegrated under the weight of massed artillery barrages. The Soviets fired an average of 295 shells per minute during the opening bombardment. And in the chaos, German military and civilian populations fled westward in what became the largest forced migration in European history. Among the refugees were thousands of women serving in auxiliary roles with the Wehrmacht, the Kriegsmarine coastal batteries, and the Reich Arbeitsdienst labor service. Helferinnen, female helpers, had been mobilized since 1943 to fill non-combat roles as the Reich's manpower reserves evaporated on the Eastern Front. By war's end, approximately 450,000 German women served in military auxiliary capacities, operating telephone switchboards in command bunkers, plotting aircraft trajectories for flak batteries defending industrial cities, processing casualty reports in field headquarters, and driving supply trucks along icy roads under constant partisan attack. When Soviet armored spearheads encircled units during the winter offensive, these women found themselves trapped alongside combat soldiers, and Red Army doctrine made no distinction between armed combatants and uniformed auxiliaries. Soviet military prosecutors working under NKVD directives classified all German military personnel as war criminals, subject to forced labor reparations, a policy formalized in State Defense Committee Order Number 9747, issued in December 1944. The legal framework was clear. Germany would pay for its invasion with labor, and women were not exempt. The capture itself was brutal and arbitrary. Soviet frontline units advancing through East Prussia in February 1945 encountered columns of fleeing civilians and disorganized Wehrmacht stragglers along roads choked with abandoned vehicles, horse-drawn carts piled with furniture and winter coats, and the frozen corpses of those who collapsed from exhaustion during the retreat. Red Army soldiers, many of whom had witnessed scorched villages and mass graves left by German occupation forces during their advance through Ukraine and Belarusia, showed little mercy. Survivor testimony collected by the German Red Cross Search Service in 1953 records systematic violence during the initial roundups, women separated from children, identification papers confiscated, arbitrary beatings to enforce compliance. One former Luftwaffe signals operator, Margarita Schiller, captured near Königsberg on February 12, 1945, recalled in a 1992 interview, "They lined us up in the town square, maybe 200 women, all in Wehrmacht uniforms or Red Cross armbands. A Soviet officer shouted in broken German that we were fascist criminals and would work to rebuild what we destroyed. They marched us east for 6 days, no food except what we scavenged from abandoned farms. Women who couldn't keep pace were left behind. We heard shots. The march was only the beginning. Captured women were initially processed through temporary holding camps, Durchgangslager, established in former German military barracks across occupied Poland and East Prussia. These facilities operated under NKVD supervision with minimal sanitation, overcrowded barracks housing up to 300 prisoners in spaces designed for 80, and interrogation protocols focused on extracting confessions of war crimes regardless of actual involvement in combat operations. Transportation to the Gulag system began in spring 1945 as Soviet authorities organized mass prisoner shipments to labor camps supporting post-war reconstruction. The rail journey itself was a slow death sentence. Freight cars designed to transport 40 men or 8 horses were packed with 70 to 90 prisoners, with 1 bucket for waste and no ventilation beyond gaps in the wooden slats. Journeys lasted between 3 and 6 weeks, depending on destination. Camps in the Ural industrial zone required shorter transit times than those in Siberia or Kazakhstan, and prisoners received irregular rations consisting of watery soup and rock-hard bread distributed once daily when trains stopped at sidings. Dehydration killed more prisoners than starvation during summer transports when temperatures inside sealed freight cars exceeded 40 degrees Celsius. Dr. Elisabeth Koch, a captured Wehrmacht medical officer who survived 5 years in Camp No. 74 near Chelyabinsk, documented her transport experience in a diary smuggled out in 1950. August 3, 1945, 14th day in the cattle car. 3 women died last night. Typhus, I think, though it could be dysentery. We wrapped them in blankets and left them in the corner because the guards won't stop to remove bodies until we reach the next depot. The smell is unspeakable. Flies everywhere. Some women have stopped eating, stopped speaking. They just stare at the walls and wait. Soviet transport records declassified in 2003 indicate that approximately 12% of prisoners died in transit before reaching assigned labor camps, though actual mortality rates were likely higher given incomplete documentation and the practice of disposing of bodies at unmarked locations along rail routes. The camps themselves were industrial death machines disguised as corrective labor facilities. The Gulag system in 1945 comprised 476 separate camp complexes employing approximately 2.5 million prisoners across timber harvesting, coal mining, construction, and manufacturing operations critical to Soviet post-war economic recovery. German POWs were distributed throughout this network with concentrations in the Ural mining districts, Kazakh steppe construction projects, and Siberian forestry zones where winter temperatures made outdoor labor lethal. Daily work quotas were calculated using pre-war Soviet labor norms multiplied by coefficients designed to maximize output. Timber crews were required to fell and process 4 cubic meters of lumber per person per shift. Coal miners had to extract 1.8 tons of anthracite. Construction brigades had to lay 200 bricks or dig 16 cubic meters of earth. Failure to meet quotas resulted in reduced rations, the so-called punishment rations, of 400 calories per day, consisting of thin soup with potato peelings and 150 grams of bread. Meeting quotas earned full rations of 700 calories, still far below the minimum required for survival under hard labor conditions. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. Prisoners who couldn't work starved, and starvation made work impossible, creating a downward spiral that killed thousands within months of arrival. Women faced additional hardships. Sexual violence by guards was systematic despite official prohibitions, and pregnancy in the camps was effectively a death sentence. Malnourished women miscarried at rates exceeding 70%, and those who delivered live births saw their infants die within weeks from exposure and lack of medical care. Medical facilities in the camps were primitive and overwhelmed. Camp hospitals functioned with 19th century equipment, no antibiotics, and minimal surgical capacity. Typhus epidemics swept through barracks every winter, killing 10 to 15% of prisoners in affected compounds. Frostbite amputations were performed without anesthesia using hacksaws sterilized in boiling water. Scurvy caused teeth to fall out and old wounds to reopen as vitamin deficiencies progressed unchecked. Camp doctors, often prisoners themselves, worked with impossible supply shortages. One testimony from Dr. Helga Brandt, captured near Danzig in March 1945, describes treating pneumonia cases with heated bricks wrapped in cloth because the camp infirmary had no medications beyond aspirin and iodine. In a letter written in 1953 after her release, she stated, "We lost 60 women in 1 week during the January 1947 epidemic. I had nothing to treat them with except verbal encouragement and stolen bread. The NKVD commander refused to quarantine infected barracks because it would reduce the labor output. They died in their bunks and were carried out each morning like cordwood." Death rates varied by camp and season, but averaged between 8 and 12% annually, with spikes during winter months when outdoor labor continued regardless of weather conditions. Official Soviet mortality statistics for German POWs acknowledged 381,687 deaths between 1945 and 1956, but these figures excluded unregistered deaths, executions without documentation, and prisoners who disappeared during transport.
Repatriation began slowly and selectively. Stalin's government used prisoner releases as political leverage during negotiations with Western allies and the emerging West German government. The first major release occurred in 1949 when approximately 25,000 sick and disabled POWs, deemed economically unproductive, were shipped back to Germany in sealed trains that dumped skeletal survivors at border crossing points in Poland. These returnees were walking evidence of Gulag conditions, which embarrassed Soviet authorities and prompted tighter controls on subsequent releases. Large-scale repatriation accelerated after Stalin's death in 1953, when reformist elements within the Soviet leadership sought to improve relations with West Germany and reduce the economic burden of maintaining vast prisoner populations. By 1956, when Chancellor Konrad Adenauer visited Moscow and negotiated the final prisoner exchange, approximately 15,000 Germans remained in Soviet custody, the majority women and older men too weak for transport. Many were never released. Some died in camps after repatriation agreements were finalized. Others were quietly transferred to psychiatric facilities or remote settlements where they lived out their lives in obscurity, forgotten by governments on both sides of the Cold War divide. Soviet authorities claimed all surviving prisoners had been returned, but German Red Cross investigations in the 1960s identified at least 5,000 cases where families received no information about captured relatives, suggesting either unreported deaths or deliberate concealment of prisoners who remained in Soviet territory for political or punitive reasons. The women who did return came home to a Germany that didn't want to hear their stories. West German society in the 1950s was focused on economic reconstruction and forward-looking optimism, the Wirtschaftswunder years, when prosperity was measured in Volkswagen production numbers and rebuilt city centers. Survivor testimony about Soviet camps was politically inconvenient, complicating diplomatic relations with Moscow and contradicting official narratives about shared wartime suffering. Returnees were often stigmatized as damaged goods, their testimonies dismissed as exaggerations or anti-communist propaganda. Many remained silent for decades, only speaking publicly in the 1980s and 90s when academic researchers began systematic documentation projects and Soviet archives partially opened under Gorbachev's glasnost policies. By then, most were elderly women whose memories were fragmentary, whose documentation had been lost or destroyed, whose suffering had become historical footnote rather than acknowledged tragedy. The German government paid minimal compensation to former POWs, monthly pensions averaging 100 Deutschmarks, later increased to 300 marks in the 1970s, but never conducted comprehensive investigations into camp conditions or pushed for Soviet accountability. The final reckoning is numerical and moral. Of the estimated 50,000 to 70,000 German women captured by Soviet forces, approximately 28,000 returned home between 1945 and 1956, according to West German repatriation records. The remainder, perhaps 40,000 souls, died in camps, during transport, or disappeared into the Soviet interior without trace. They were clerks who answered telephones, nurses who bandaged wounded soldiers, teenagers drafted into anti-aircraft crews defending their cities from Allied bombers. They were not architects of genocide or planners of invasion. They were participants in a war machine that committed unspeakable crimes, yes, but their individual guilt ranged from complicity to innocence, and their collective punishment exceeded any reasonable standard of justice. The Gulag consumed them not because of what they had done, but because of what their nation had unleashed. And in the cold calculus of post-war retribution, individual lives mattered less than symbolic vengeance and economic exploitation. Their story reminds us that war's cruelty extends far beyond battlefields, that victors can be as pitiless as aggressors, and that history's losers are forgotten twice, first by the victors who write official accounts, then by their own nations eager to forget uncomfortable truths. These women deserved better than silence, and their memory demands more than footnotes in academic journals. They were lost forever in Soviet camps, but they should not be lost to history, because once we forget the individual faces behind mass tragedy, we make it easier for such tragedies to happen again.